Hi students, today we will have a bit of a dry and boring start to our lecture, but after the introduction I hope that you will get the idea what we will be talking about in the next few minutes. So I pray and hope that you survive this introductory part. Let's first try to build a case for the lecture and get through the introduction. I hope you are ready now. So here we start. When we try to know about literary writings in the 18th century, we should keep in mind that reason and passion will be the two impulses guiding the writers of the time. Further, these impulses shall be displayed or given expression in a desire for pursuits including order, symmetry, decorum, and scientific knowledge. Likewise, we will notice the writers cultivating the feelings of philanthropy, exalting personal relationships, religious fervor, and the cult of sentiment or sensibility. Furthermore, the rational impulse or the desire to be ruled through reason would foster wit, satire, and argument. For instance, wit and satire or the cult of building argument abound when we read Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and Samuel Johnson, who carried these trends forward after John Dryden. We also notice rational realism and psychological probing in the novels if we come across novelists including Henry Fielding, Daniel Defoe, Tobias Smollett, and Samuel Richardson, respectively. So that's how I have tried to introduce the Augustan age. And I can imagine that such introductory statements would be less appealing to the beginners in particular. I have therefore decided to go stepwise and make you know about the age in bits and pieces. The first question that we will raise here is that why the 18th century literature includes the label, the Augustan age. For this we need to do a little history work. Historically, Augustan age refers to an era in Latin literary history from somewhere 34 BC to 18 AD, which is generally rated as the golden age for literature, particularly poetry, which reached its finest expressions. If we talk in political sense, the age was also marked by civil peace and prosperity. If we examine this whole era, we see many poets who composed sophisticated verse with patriotism, love, and nature as the main themes, and they were mostly addressed to a patron or Emperor Augustus Caesar. Let us take few examples, and we find that several Latin masterpieces, including Virgil's Georgics and Aeneid, Horace's Odes and Elegies, were written in this age. Also, we see Livy, who began his monumental history of Rome. In the same manner, Ovid, who was the author of Metamorphoses, a mythological history of the world from the creation to the Augustan age, was perhaps the last great writer of this golden age, as his death in exile in 17 AD is said to mark an end to this period. I think this is enough for us as we have formed some idea about the Latin Augustan age. But I can imagine that you are wondering as to why do we associate 18th century England with the Augustan age. Here it is. Let us solve this problem too and let us connect it with the 18th century. First, you should remember that in both the ages, the Augustan age and the 18th century, the writers were patronized, and the literary writings were conscious and deliberate rather than the outcome of free creative effort and inspiration. Second, both were at political, social, and cultural fronts stable societies enjoying comparative peace. Please note that we call the 18th century beginning a peaceful time mainly because there was no civil war or internal struggles as was the case in the Restoration era, nor were there upheavals at mass level as was the case after the French Revolution. Here at this point, please be clear that when we refer to 18th century as the Augustan age, you may find several books and authors meaning only the first quarter of the century, and if so, you need not worry or get confused. It is widely believed that the Augustan age ended with the death of great writers including Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift in the 1740s. I hope it makes sense now. Now that we have addressed the first question, let us go to our next point. Here I will focus patronage of literary writers. In the beginning, I referred to the idea of patrons while talking about the Augustan age. So those who did not get it there, they will find an explanation here. Literary patronage needs a reference to the political context of the early 18th century. We would, however, avoid details but just say that England at that time had two main political parties, including the Whigs and the Tories. Both these parties wanted propagation of their ideologies, and for that purpose, they needed the support of writers. Thus, they would hire and sponsor and pay writers for promoting their agenda, and so started the era of patronage. If so, we may argue that the literature in that era was mostly politically motivated, biased to the extent that it existed not for its own sake but for promoting or discrediting political ideologies. In the sense of literary forms, such patronage promoted a culture of pamphlets, periodicals, and other essays, and the idea of journalistic literature, of course. Now we move forward to the next point. In the Augustan age, we notice that people would sit and chat and discuss in clubs and coffee houses as their favorite meeting places. This culture was equally attractive for politicians and writers and the high society. Now, how this culture of coffee houses came into existence, it must be or it may be attributed to the political changes that affected the society. Are you getting my point? Okay, no worries. Let me take you back to the glorious revolution of 1688, which we define as a victory of the town over the court. I mean, a victory of the middle classes or the middle class in true sense. This victory we interpret as a defeat for the court, its standards and mannerisms and morals. In a sense, the court was rejected as a source dictating and defining the way of life. If so, then after the victory, there was bound to be a need for establishing new standards, new social and ethical code, and that in return would, of course, require education of the citizens. I hope you are getting what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I mean to establish is education should have become the legitimate concern of literary writers, teaching people and educating them to meet the requirements of the new code of life. Now let us synthesize and combine the 2 points. We can say that once the court culture was rejected, meetings shifted to coffee houses, houses where these people would engage and discuss in a polished, refined, and elegant style. Once we have reached this point, I want to draw your attention to the style and the new code that was encouraged and propagated. And this is also related to the next part of our discussion, which is why it is called the NeoClassical age. According to Hudson, most of the 18th century writers believed that classical writers, means Latin and Greek writers, had set standards and they had presented the best models. They believed that those standards and models should be followed as guiding principles and treated as laws and rules to govern what was composed and created. In a sense, we call it NeoClassical age as it derived energy, guidance, and rules from Greek and Roman writers. The classical writers had a harmonious balance between form and content, or we can say between subject matter and manner, which according to some critics, the 18th century writers did not fully follow. But this is just a point that we need to keep in mind, because we don't need to idealize the two like the following of the classical writers by the 18 is 100% accurate. I hope the point has been established, but one thing remains. We talked about the new code and the style above, and we need to conclude that when we refer to the code or style, it was derived from these classical writers. So already when we were talking above that about the style, it was actually these classical writers who were taken as a guiding source for formulating that style. Now let me have another argument. If literature is more educative than a source of entertainment, then we can argue that this may be one good reason of decline in drama writing and poetry in comparison to novel and other forms of literary readings. With these few bits of background information, now I feel confident to take you to the next level, in which we will discuss some literary characteristics of the age. First and foremost, among the characteristics would be its relation to prose. We know that it is popularly called an age of prose and reason. Now we need to refer again to the political parties and the promotion of their respective ideologies, as we mentioned earlier. In that case, we can imagine that poetry was less suited to propagate ideologies and to educate the people in manners and morals. Thus, we see prose flourishing in all forms, including pamphlets, magazines, periodicals, newspapers, novels, and so on. If we see the poetic outpourings of poets like Alexander Pope or Samuel Johnson, they were witty but lacked apologies. They were witty but lacked imaginative fire and creative appeal. I hope it's clear now. Now, a step ahead, this is also called an age of satire. Please don't lose focus and keep in mind the political parties and their ideologies. They are also crucial to our understanding when we call it an age of satire. But before establishing this point, let us first help those students who are less clear about the concept of satire. Its definition includes a writer's use of irony or humor or exaggeration aimed at exposing others. Now, back to the point, it is called an age of satire as each political party would ask writers to satirize and thus expose the opposite party and its ideology. In that sense, satire was used to find faults, to ridicule, sometimes to the extent of using invective or insult or abusing others. But satire in this age was not political only. If you remember, we referred to educating the masses in our discussion a while ago, and in that sense too, satire can prove very effective in correcting the wrongs and thus an effective means of educating the readers. I would also request you to note that satire may destroy if partisan and biased, but it has also a constructive spirit if directed toward criticizing the wrongs in society. Let us have an example. Jonathan Swift was a famous figure in the Augustan age. He wrote a modest proposal in which he advocates selling the meat of undernourished children at the age of 1. And of course, he's talking about the children from poor families. And he says that this will combat overpopulation, unemployment, lowering the family expenses, and improving food options for the rich. Now, I would be definitely interested in knowing your reaction to it. Is it something inhuman or undesirable? You hate Swift for having said all this? But don't you think that he is actually targeting the indifference of the rich to the plight and the miseries that poor people are suffering from? In that sense, he may be satirizing the attitude of the ruling class and the rich, leaving the poor at the mercy of no one. I hope we are now clear when we say that it was an age of satire. So let's head toward explaining it as an age of good sense too. It is called an age of good sense, in which case we may associate it with reason. Good sense means being reasonable and avoiding what is extravagant or supernatural or mystical or visionary. Here, I don't have much to share with you, and I hope that you can read further for yourselves to determine what were the characteristics of this age with reference to good sense. Let us talk about some of the themes that are frequently found in the writings of the Augustan age. But before we talk about the themes, I hope you will keep in mind the points we have already raised, like educating and manners and morals, etc., etc. These points demanded a discussion of life and society, and therefore we find that most of the time the literature would discuss town or city life, its ways, manners, morals, the middle class values, and moralizing, of course. We can argue, for instance, that Alexander Pope had this moralizing aspect of literature in mind when he composed The Rape of the Lock, a mock heroic epic exposing the follies of the high society with the aim to teach and to delight. The writers of 18th century also believed in following nature. However, they interpreted nature as men and their manners, which, according to them, had already been modeled and described by classical writers. All that they needed was to rephrase and reinforce those ancient rules. For them, as in the words of Alexander Pope, the proper study of mankind was man. Okay, now before taking you to the next point, please note that so far we have been talking about the early 18th century with polarized political parties with bitterness in their relations and ideologies. The literary people siding with either of the two parties, and such other kinds of political polarizations. Now, after several years of democracy and growth of the middle class, the rivalries had become a routine matter. The readers had multiplied, and they were more public than partisan in their outlook. Many writers had started writing and were read by public. This was essentially a change in society, and so we notice a gradual shift in mid-half of the century. And please note, this gradual shift or change in attitude is what we call the age of transition. And this same time is also called the age of sensibility. That would, in the course of few decades, give birth to the Romantic movement or Romanticism. In this transitional period, we notice a decline in political pamphleteering and literary patronage. Many authors parted ways with political parties, or you can say that they became indifferent to the political scene and became more public. In this age of transition, literary writers continued following the Greek and Roman writers, but they also recognized great value in exploring individual feelings and emotions. This recognition, now please note, this recognition and emphasis on feelings and emotions made it historically identified as the age of sensibility. And of course, we are talking about the later half of the 18th century. Earlier, we referred to the age of good sense, and there we placed reason above everything. But here we notice an addition of individual motives and individual reactions to sensory or intellectual or spiritual, or you can say social stimuli. Then came a landmark event in the shape of the French Revolution. And this event marked a violent end to autocratic, feudal, and monarchical powers and asserted the right and supremacy of the individual free will. This revolution also paved the way for reviving literature, uh, implying liberation from all forms of artificial bondages or prescribed rules, expression of individual men, their lives and emotions, asserting the dignity of self and spirit, cherishing the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These values, when combined, we call it the Romantic movement or the Romantic period. And its advocates included William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, and of course some other good writers. This I leave for now, as it is going to be the topic that we will cover in the next session. So all that I hope for now is that you have formed an idea about literature in the 18th century, and I pray you keep the excitement on for the next lecture. So please stay tuned and share the lecture with other friends too for increased you know dissemination of knowledge. So I thank you very much for your time. See you next time. Thank you very much.